Imagine being so close to the enemy that you can smell the tobacco on their breath, feel the vibration of their boots hitting the ground inches from your face, and hear their conversations as if they were your own teammates. Now imagine you're holding the most advanced rifle of the 1960s, fully loaded, safety off, and you're trained to kill with surgical precision. But you can't pull the trigger, not because you're a coward, but because pulling that trigger would be the last thing you'd ever do. This is the true story of 5 SAS operators who found themselves surrounded by over 400 North Vietnamese Army soldiers deep in enemy territory and made a decision that defied every combat instinct they had been trained to follow. Southeast Asia, 1966. The Vietnam War was escalating into one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. While American forces were engaged in large-scale operations and the Australian Army had committed battalions to the fight, a small, secretive unit was operating in the shadows. The British Special Air Service, the SAS, had deployed reconnaissance teams to Vietnam under a veil of secrecy. Their mission was not to engage in firefights or rack up enemy body counts like the conventional forces. Their purpose was intelligence gathering, deep penetration reconnaissance, and gathering actionable information that could save hundreds of lives and change the course of operations. These men were ghosts, trained to see without being seen, to move through hostile territory like smoke through a forest, and most importantly, to have the discipline to hold fire even when every instinct screamed to fight. Sergeant Tom Matthews, call sign Ghost, was the patrol commander. At 32 years old, he was a veteran of multiple tours, including Borneo and Malaya. His face was weathered, his eyes constantly scanning, and his voice rarely rose above a whisper, even in safe areas. Ghost earned his nickname not because he was quiet, but because he had an uncanny ability to disappear in the environment. He could stand 3 feet from you in the jungle, and you would never know he was. Tonight, that ability would be tested beyond anything he had ever experienced. Beside him was Corporal James Fletcher, known simply as Jimmy, the radio operator. Jimmy was 28, compact and wiry, with steady hands that never shook no matter how bad things got. The radio on his back was their lifeline to the outside world, their only connection to extraction helicopters, artillery support, and command. But in this line of work, using that radio could also be a death sentence if done at the wrong moment. Lance Corporal David Williams, call sign Taff, was the team's reconnaissance specialist. A Welshman with an extraordinary memory for detail, Taff could observe an enemy position for 30 seconds and then draw you a map with accurate distances, weapon placements, and even estimate the morale of the troops based on their body language. He was 26, lean and athletic, with eyes that never stopped moving. His role tonight would be critical beyond measure. Mark Johnson, known as Digger, was the youngest at 24. An Australian exchange soldier with the SAS, Digger had grown up in the outback and knew jungle survival like most people knew their own home. But this was his first major operation in Vietnam, and the weight of it pressed on his chest like a physical force. He had proven himself in training 100 times over, but combat was different, and deep down he knew tonight would define him as a soldier. Finally, there was Sean O'Connor, call sign Paddy, the team's sniper. An Irishman with steady hands and steadier nerves, Paddy could put a round through a target at 800 meters in high wind. At 29, he had more confirmed kills than anyone else on the patrol, but he also understood something that many snipers never learned. Knowing when not to shoot was just as important as the trigger. The 5 men had been inserted into the operational area 3 days. They had moved carefully through the dense jungle, avoiding trails, crossing streams to break their scent, and sleeping in shifts with at least 2 men awake at all times. Their objective was a suspected North Vietnamese Army supply route that ran through a narrow valley approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest Allied base. Intelligence suggested that the NVA was moving equipment and troops south in preparation for a major offensive, but the exact scale and timing were unknown. That was what Ghost and his team were there to find out. They had established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the suspected route, camouflaged it with natural vegetation, and settled in to watch and wait. For 2 days, they saw nothing but local farmers and the occasional small patrol. The team rotated watch duties, ate cold rations, and communicated with base via scheduled radio checks using coded messages that lasted no more than 5 seconds. On the 3rd night, everything changed. It was around 2100 hours, and the jungle was alive with the sounds of insects, distant birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Ghost was on watch with Taff, both men lying flat on their bellies behind a natural screen of ferns and fallen logs. Paddy was 10 meters to their left, his sniper rifle resting on a bipod, scanning the valley below through his scope. Jimmy and Digger were slightly behind, resting but not sleeping, weapons within arm's reach. Then Taff heard it. At first it was so faint he thought it might be his imagination, but within seconds it became unmistakable. The sound of many men moving through the jungle, not the careful, measured movement of patrol, but the steady, rhythmic sound of a large formation on the march. Taff touched Ghost's shoulder and pointed down the valley. Ghost heard it too and immediately signaled the rest of the team. Within seconds, all 5 men were alert, weapons ready, eyes straining into the darkness below. The sound grew louder. It was not just footsteps, but the clank of equipment, the creak of leather straps, the muffled voices of men talking in low tones. Ghost's mind raced through the possibilities. A company? A battalion? His stomach tightened as he realized the scale of what was approaching. Through his night vision device, Ghost began to see shapes emerging from the tree line below, moving in a long, disciplined column along the trail. Dozens of, then more and more. The column seemed endless. He counted quickly, 50, 70, 100, and they kept coming. His heart rate spiked, but his training kicked in. He controlled his breathing, slowed his pulse, and assessed the situation with cold logic. They were directly above a major NVA troop movement, possibly the largest anyone had seen in this sector. This was exactly the kind of intelligence their mission was designed to gather. But they were also in the worst possible position, close enough to observe, but far too close to survive if discovered. Ghost made eye contact with each member of his team and gave a series of hand signals. Freeze, no movement, no sound, weapons safe. The last command caused a flicker of surprise in Paddy's eyes, but the sniper nodded and carefully ensured his rifle's safety was engaged. Ghost then pointed to his eyes and then to the valley below. Observe and remember everything. Taff nodded and began his mental catalog. The team pressed themselves into the earth, becoming part of the terrain. They controlled their breathing, slowed their heart rate through sheer force of will, and prepared for what was about to happen. The NVA column continued to pour out of the jungle below. Ghost revised his estimate upward, 200, 300. This was not a company. This was at least a full battalion, possibly more. They were heavily armed, carrying AK-47 rifles, RPG launchers, heavy machine guns, and what looked like mortar components broken down for transport. This was a unit preparing for serious combat operations. As the column moved closer to their position, Ghost realized with growing dread that the NVA were not staying on the trail below. They were spreading out to establish a temporary rest position, and some of them were moving up the slope directly toward the SAS observation post. There was no time to move. Any movement now would be detected instantly. Ghost signaled again. Total freeze, the team understood. They were about to have enemy soldiers walking through their position, and their only chance of survival was to become invisible. Digger felt his heart hammering in his chest. This was beyond anything he had imagined. He forced himself to breathe slowly through his nose, shallow breaths that would not move his chest visibly. He could see NVA soldiers now, no more than 20 meters away, moving up the slope. Some were sitting down, taking drinks from canteens. Others were smoking cigarettes, and some were still climbing, heading directly toward where the SAS team lay hidden. Paddy watched through his scope as 3 NVA soldiers approached his position. One of them was an officer, based on his uniform and the way the other 2 deferred to him. They were talking casually, and Paddy could hear every word even though he did not speak via. The tone was relaxed, tired. These men were not on high alert. They had no idea that 5 enemy soldiers were lying within spitting distance. The officer stopped less than 2 meters from Paddy's position. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and stood there smoking while looking out over the valley. The glow of the cigarette illuminated his face. Paddy could see the man's features clearly, the fatigue in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged slightly. He was just a soldier, tired from a long march, taking a moment to rest. But he was also the enemy, and Paddy had a perfect shot. One squeeze of the trigger, and the officer would be dead before he hit the ground. But Paddy did not move. His finger stayed outside the trigger guard, resting against the stock of his rifle. He controlled his breathing and waited. Ghost felt the vibration through the ground before he saw them. More soldiers were moving up the slope, and they were heading directly toward his position. He pressed himself flatter into the earth, willing himself to become part of the ground. His face was turned to the side, his cheek against the dirt, his eyes barely open, watching through slitted lids. A boot came down less than 30 centimeters from his head. He could see the worn leather, the mud caked on the sole, the frayed laces. Another step, and the soldier would have stepped on it. Ghost did not breathe. The soldier paused, standing right next to Ghost's prone form. Ghost could smell the man, the scent of sweat, tobacco, and the distinctive smell of the fish sauce that was a staple of Vietnamese. The soldier said something to a companion, laughed, and then moved on. Ghost remained frozen for another 10 seconds, then slowly, carefully, allowed himself a shallow breath. Taff was counting and observing. He had trained himself to record details even under extreme stress, and now that training was being put to the ultimate test. He noted weapon types, counted squad sizes, observed equipment loads, and tried to estimate the overall strength of the formation. He saw heavy weapons teams, medical personnel identifiable by the red crosses on their packs, officers moving up and down the column, and even what looked like a political commissar based on the distinctive uniform. This was a full-strength battalion, possibly reinforced, and they were equipped for sustained operations. The intelligence value of this observation was immense, but only if they survived to report it. A soldier sat down less than a meter from Taft's position, his back against it. The man unslung his rifle, set it beside him, and pulled out a rice ball wrapped in. He ate slowly, methodically, occasionally looking around but seeing nothing. Taft watched the man's every movement, committing his equipment to memory while simultaneously calculating how many seconds it would take to kill him if necessary. Jimmy's mind was on the radio. They needed to report this, but transmitting now was impossible. The NVA were too close, and even a whispered radio call would be. The radio itself was designed to be low noise, but the squelch break when receiving a transmission would be audible to anyone within a few meters. He had switched it off completely, knowing that command would be expecting their scheduled check-in, but trusting that they would understand. The silence meant the team was in a dangerous situation. He would have to wait, possibly for hours, until the NVA moved on. If they moved on, there was always the possibility that this unit would establish a longer-term position here, which would put the SAS team in an impossible situation. Jimmy forced those thoughts away and focused on remaining still and silent. Digger was fighting his own internal battle. Fear was clawing at his chest, trying to force him to move, to run, to do something other than lie here passively while hundreds of enemy soldiers walked past. His training had prepared him for combat, for firefights and ambushes, but not for this kind of psychological. He wanted to look around, to see where the enemy were, to track threats, but he knew that movement meant death, so he stared at the patch of ground in front of his face and counted his breaths. 1, 2. He focused on keeping each breath shallow and silent. 4, 5, 6. A soldier walked past so close that Digger could have reached out and touched his leg. 7, 8, 9. The soldier stopped. Digger's heart froze. Had he been seen? Was this it? 10, 11, 12. The soldier moved on. Digger kept counting. It was all he could do to maintain sanity. The minutes stretched into an hour. The NVA column continued to move through the area, with more and more soldiers stopping to rest near the SAS position. At one point, Ghost estimated there were at least 50 enemy soldiers within a 20-meter radius of his team. Some were sitting, some standing, some lying down to sleep. The SAS team was completely surrounded, invisible only because the NVA had no reason to look closely at the ground around them. The psychological pressure was immense. Every soldier on the team knew that discovery meant certain death. 5 men against 400 had no chance in a firefight. Even if they killed a dozen or more in the opening seconds, they would be overwhelmed in moments, and calling in artillery or air support would take too long, and the danger-close nature of the situation meant they would likely be caught in their own supporting fire. Ghost's mind worked through options continuously. If they were discovered, what would he do? Try to break contact and run? Impossible in this terrain with this many enemy around them? Call in fire on their own position and hope they survived? Possible, but the chances were slim. Fight and go down, taking as many as possible with them? That was the default option, but it went against everything the SAS stood for. Their value was in the intelligence they gathered, not in heroic last stands. No, the only real option was to remain undetected. That meant absolute discipline, no matter what happened. Even if an NVA soldier stepped directly on one of them, the correct response would be to remain still and hope the soldier thought he had tripped on a log or root. It sounded insane, but it was the only way. After what felt like an eternity, the NVA began to move again. Orders were passed down the line in low voices, and soldiers started getting to their feet, shouldering their weapons and equipment. The column reformed and continued its march south, but they moved slowly, and it took another hour for the main body to pass through. Even then, a rearguard element remained behind, scanning the area for threats or signs of being followed. Ghost knew they could not move yet. They had to wait until they were absolutely certain the area was clear. The team remained frozen in place, muscles screaming from maintaining the same position for over 3 hours. None of them moved. They were too professional, too well trained, and they had come too far to compromise themselves now. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, the last of the NVA soldiers moved out. The jungle fell silent except for the natural sounds of insects and birds beginning their morning chorus. Ghost waited another 30 minutes, scanning with all his senses for any sign of remaining enemy presence. Then, slowly, he raised his head and looked around. Clear. He signaled the team. Slowly, carefully, each man began to move, stretching cramped muscles and checking their weapons. No one spoke. They communicated entirely through hand signals. Ghost pointed to Jimmy and then to the radio. Time to report. Jimmy carefully moved to a position with better antenna clearance, extended the radio's antenna, and powered on the unit. He waited for it to warm up, then keyed the microphone 3 times in quick succession. The signal for contact report, priority traffic. Seconds later, the radio crackled a response. Base was listening. Jimmy whispered into the microphone using the brevity codes they had memorized. He transmitted their position, the size of the enemy force, direction of travel, equipment observed, and estimated capabilities. The entire transmission took less than 90 seconds. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Base came back with a single word: confirm. They wanted verification of the unit size. Jimmy repeated the estimate: 400 plus, battalion strength, heavy weapons, moving south. Another pause, longer this time. Then Base acknowledged and ordered them to continue observation and report again in 12 hours. Jimmy powered down the radio and gave Ghost a thumbs up. The message was sent. Whatever happened now, Command had the information. Ghost nodded and signaled for the team to prepare to move. They could not stay here. The NVA might send patrols back through this area, and they needed to relocate to a safer position. As the team carefully packed their equipment and prepared to move, Paddy looked back at the spot where the NVA officer had stood, smoking his cigarette. He thought about how easy the shot would have been, how his training had screamed at him to take it, but he also understood why Ghost had ordered weapons safe. If he had fired, they would all be dead now. The mission would have failed. Command would never have received the intelligence about a battalion-strength enemy force moving into position. Allied units in the path of that NVA battalion would have been caught by surprise. People would have died because of one moment of indiscipline. By not firing, by enduring the psychological torture of lying motionless while surrounded by the enemy, they had achieved what they had been sent to do. They had gathered critical intelligence and survived to deliver it. That was the mission. That was what the SAS did. The team moved out, disappearing into the jungle like smoke. They relocated to a new observation position 3 kilometers away, established security, and settled in to continue their mission. Over the next 4 days, they tracked the movement of NVA forces through the area, identified supply caches, mapped trails, and reported everything back to base. The intelligence they provided was used to plan a major Allied operation that intercepted the NVA battalion before it could reach its objective. The subsequent engagement resulted in heavy enemy casualties and the disruption of an entire offensive operation. None of the 5 SAS soldiers were present for that battle. By the time it happened, they had already been extracted and were back at base, debriefing intelligence officers and preparing for their next mission. Years later, when Ghost was asked about that night, he would describe it as the hardest thing he ever did in his military career. Not the hardest fight, but the hardest test of discipline. Any soldier can pull a trigger when threatened. That is instinct, training, survival reflex. But to not pull the trigger when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to fight, to instead trust in your training and your commander's judgment, that requires a different kind of courage. It requires the courage to be patient, to think strategically rather than tactically, to prioritize the mission over personal survival instincts. That is what separates Special Operations Forces from conventional troops. Not superior weapons or physical conditioning, though those are important. What separates them is the mental discipline to do the harder thing, the smarter thing, even when it goes against every natural instinct. For Jimmy, the experience reinforced the critical importance of communications. He understood that his radio was not just a tool for calling for help, but a strategic asset that had to be used at the right time and in the right way. Transmitting when surrounded by the enemy would have been suicide, but waiting until the coast was clear and then delivering a complete, accurate report had real strategic value. That information saved lives and changed the course of operation. For Taff, the night was validation of his training in observation and memory. In the chaos and fear of being surrounded, he had still managed to catalog vital intelligence about enemy strength, equipment, and capabilities. That information had been included in Jimmy's radio report and had been crucial in planning the Allied response. For Digger, the experience was his baptism by fire, though no shots were fired. He had faced his fear, controlled it, and performed his duty under the most extreme psychological pressure imaginable. He would go on to serve multiple tours in Vietnam and would eventually earn his own command, but he would always remember that night as the moment he truly became a soldier. Paddy's reflection on the experience was perhaps the most profound. As a sniper, he had been trained to think of himself as a strategic asset, a tool for eliminating high-value targets and creating tactical advantages. But that night taught him that sometimes the most valuable thing a sniper can do is not shoot. By holding his fire, he had allowed a far greater victory than any single kill could have achieved. He had helped preserve his team's stealth, enabled the intelligence gathering mission to succeed, and ultimately contributed to an operation that achieved strategic objective. One bullet, no matter how well placed, could never have accomplished. It was a lesson that stayed with him for the rest of his career, and one that he would pass on to every young sniper he trained in. The story of that 5-man SAS patrol and their night surrounded by an entire NVA battalion became a teaching case in special operations training programs around the world. It illustrated several critical principles that define special operations forces. First, the importance of mission discipline. The team's objective was intelligence gathering, not combat, and they stayed true to that objective even under extreme pressure. Second, the value of training and trust. Each member of the team trusted their commander's judgment and had the discipline to follow orders, even when those orders went against natural instinct. Third, the strategic thinking that separates special operations from conventional warfare. By not engaging the enemy, the team achieved far more than they ever could have in a firefight. And fourth, the recognition that courage is not always about fighting, but sometimes about having the discipline to not fight when fighting would be easier. The incident also highlighted the unique selection and training processes that produce soldiers capable of this level of performance. Not everyone can do what Ghost and his did that night. It requires a specific combination of mental toughness, discipline, intelligence, and the ability to control fear rather than being controlled by it. This is why special operations selection courses have such high failure rates. The physical challenges are difficult, but the mental and psychological demands are even harder. Instructors are looking for individuals who can think clearly under pressure, who can prioritize mission over self, and who have the discipline to do the harder right thing rather than the easier wrong thing. The night surrounded by 400 NVA soldiers was the ultimate test of those qualities, and Ghosts passed with flying colors. In the broader context of the Vietnam War, operations like this one were relatively unknown to the public, but were crucial to the overall war effort. While the media focused on large-scale battles and the controversial aspects of American strategy, small special operations teams were conducting reconnaissance missions that provided the intelligence necessary for effective operations. They moved through enemy territory for weeks at a time, often without resupply or reinforcement, gathering information and occasionally conducting direct action missions against high-value targets. The work was dangerous, unglamorous, and rarely recognized, but it was essential. The intelligence provided by teams like Ghosts saved countless lives by allowing commanders to make informed decisions about where and when to commit forces. The legacy of operations like this one continues to influence special operations doctrine today. Modern special forces units around the world study cases like the 5-man SAS patrol, surrounded by 400 NVA soldiers, because it teaches lessons that remain relevant regardless of changes in technology or tactics. The fundamental principles of mission discipline, trust in leadership, strategic thinking, and mental toughness are timeless. They were as important in the jungles of Vietnam in 1966 as they are in the mountains of Afghanistan or the urban battlefields of modern conflicts. The tools and weapons may change, but the human qualities required for success in special operations remain constant. For the men who lived through that night, it remained a defining moment in their lives. They would each go on to complete their tours in Vietnam and return home to continue their military. Some would stay in the SAS, eventually reaching senior leadership, Others would move on to other assignments or leave the military entirely. But none of them ever forgot the night they lay motionless in the dirt while 400 enemy soldiers walked past, and none of them ever doubted the decision that Ghost had made. It was the right call, the only call, and it exemplified everything that the SAS stood for. Who Dares Wins is the motto of the Special Air Service, and it is often interpreted as encouragement to take bold action. But that night in the Vietnamese jungle, Ghost and his team demonstrated another interpretation of that motto. Sometimes daring to win means having the discipline to not act, to wait, to endure, and to trust that patience and intelligence will achieve more than violence and aggression. If you found this story as gripping as we did bringing it to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible untold stories of courage and strategy from history's most elite. Hit that like button if this story of discipline over firepower impressed you, and drop a comment below telling us what historical special operations story you want us to cover next. Your support keeps these stories alive.